Okay, so welcome back everybody to Avalon Rising at Sunrise Celebration 2011. So we're really kicking off today with a ridiculous amount of talks and workshops and ceremonies and many other things. So we're really pleased that it's all kind of happening. We're filming lots of it with Jonathan Adams of Pentos TV, so we're going to even have some DVDs available today if anyone really wants to catch up on any of this. And we might even be live streaming it on the internet. So if any of you have got access or any friends who might want to watch it aren't here, please, we'll give you the link a bit later. So anyway, our speaker now is Adrian Incledon-Webber, and he's going to be discussing the Hurlers stone circle and also some information about the Shining Ones, which have a very deep prehistoric kind of mystery. So please give a warm welcome to Adrian Incledon-Webber.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hugh, as well. It's been quite interesting looking at the slides here. You've got stone circles and dowsing, which I kind of enjoy both. We'll be bringing a bit of both into the talk as we go through. Does anybody douse here? I know one or two of you. I recognise one or two faces. And has anybody been down to the Hurlers down in Cornwall, the stone circles? One or two as well. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got a preaching to some of the converted, which is rather nice. Just very quickly, for my background, I am the Vice President of the British Society of Dowsers at the moment, and I also run the Earth Energy Group side of the business, which basically brings a mixture of dowsing and earth energies very, very close to the fore. We're trying to do a lot of experiments, a lot of scientific experiments at the moment to try and prove how dowsing works. But this is very much practical dowsing over the last 4 or 5 years I've been doing with a very good friend of mine down in Cornwall. Now, the Hurlers is a set of originally 3 stone circles just in Bodmin Moor, just to the southwest of Launceston. It's a wonderful place. Unfortunately, as it's Cornwall, it tends to rain quite a lot down there, so a lot of the stuff that I was doing initially got completely waterlogged, all the paperwork, and we had to go back and redo it all. But it's a fascinating group of 3 stone circles with almost an Orion Belts alignment. There are lots of other sacred sites, including 1 or 2 long barrows, the cheese ring, which is very much Druid implications over the years. But if you haven't been down, it's well worth going. Now, I went down there with a very good friend of mine just to do some practical dowsing with him. Because of the famed Michael and Mary lines running through, which we'll go through in a few minutes' time, is a wonderful place to go. If you like earth energies, then it's a perfect place to be. So, as you can, the graphics aren't brilliant on here, but as you can see from the old map, you have, let me come around a minute. The 3 stone circles, you've 1, 2, 3. The 3 stone circles down there in the Orion Belt alignment. There's been a lot of lead mining there over the years, so the ground is very, very uneven and actually very, very difficult to see what the original ground must have been like. As you see from a Google Earth map, you've got the 3 stone circles, not particularly apparent. And a lot of the pock marks you can see to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen are partly the lead mining holes that have been left over the years. The middle stone circle is probably the best preserved of the 3. You've got the main stone circles, which are there. The black ones are there. 1 or 2 recumbent stones, the white ones are the missing stone circles. There's been a bit of work done on them over the years, a bit of reconstruction work done on them over the years, but they generally feel, from some of the earlier drawings, this is probably the best number of stones that were there, and by dowsing as well, you're picking up the fact that, yes, the stones have been there. Interesting enough to note is the actual centre stone was never actually central within the stone circle. It was always off line like that, and you'll be able to see why as we go through. The top circle, the northernmost circle, you'll see the cheese ring in the background, isn't particularly well preserved, but is certainly slightly better than the bottom ring. And again, you can see the various stones, the big ones lying down haven't been put up, and the bottom circle is the least preserved. As you can see there, only 1 or 2 stones left. Now, the reason for it is just during the Second World War, when the Americans were stationed down there, they were using tanks. They thought it was actually funny to actually run some of the stone circles over. So they were sort of practicing around knocking these stones left, right and centre, and actually not caring a jot that they were actually way, way older than their country put together. So David Lockwood and I, the guy on the right hand side and me on the left hand side, decided one day just to head down there just to see what we could find. The great thing about dowsing is if you can dowse, get a yes or no answer from a dowsing rod or a pendulum or intuition, you are never ever bored, especially at sacred sites. I remember as a child going down to Stonehenge, the days where it was open access to everybody. You could just literally pay your fee and you could go and climb on the stones, which when I was 8 or 9 years old I did so. And unfortunately now, because Stonehenge is now walled off, you never really get a particularly good feeling of the site. In those days you'd walk in, you could buy a very, very dry HMSO booklet giving you an idea of what Stonehenge was all about. But as a child, you'd read half a page and never understand what the book was all about in the first place. So then I started dowsing at a very, very early age, and I found that you could start communicating with Spirit of Place, the guardian of the site, start asking questions about why it was there, how long it's been there. Unfortunately, it actually defies all the timelines that most of the scientists now give it, as does the stone circles at the Hurlers. Now, the reason we went down there, have you all heard of Hamish Miller, the late dowser? I know obviously one or two of you have. Hamish and a very good friend of his, Paul Broadhurst, both very, very good earth energy dowsers, had picked up on John Michel's Michael line, the big alignment running from Cornwall up through to the South Norfolk coast. And Hamish was outside one day just dowsing and picked up on this beautiful masculine line, which he then dubbed the Michael line, because every church it ran through seemed to be dedicated to either St. Michael or to St. George, the equivalent. So Hamish and Paul decided that it would be a great thing to go and investigate this line and write a book about it. They started down in Cornwall, walked all the way through. Every, I don't know, probably sort of half a day, every maybe 100 miles, they would actually come across a node point, this unusual hotspot that they couldn't really define at the time. They got all the way up to Avebury. They'd gone through Stonehenge and many, many other monuments along the way. They finally got up to Avebury, where this feminine line did an amazing dance around Avebury. So the masculine line did an amazing dance around Avebury. Then they discovered the actual node point was a further energy line actually crossing at those particular points. Hamish dowsed around Avebury and actually found that this beautiful line, these two intertwining lines, ran through from Windmill Hill, through Avebury, down through Silbury Hill, West Kennet Long Barrow, Swallowhead Spring, met at the sanctuary and then disappeared off, heading up towards Norfolk. So Hamish and Paul went all the way back down to Cornwall where they started, and their long exploits started all over again. The book now called The Sullen Serpent. If you're a dowser or like Earth Mysteries, it's probably the perfect book to start with. Once you buy it, you read through it within probably a day, and then literally you're in the car with a set of dowsing rods actually finding where these lines are. The difficulty is they are flexible, and having been in Avebury a couple of days ago, these lines are all over the place. They're not fixed, and it's interesting from Hamish's point of view. He was always one for new thoughts coming through, and I'd talk to him about it. He said, of course they're not fixed. But of course, once you've written the book, you put everything down in black and white. A lot of people look at them as very much fixed lines, but they're not. They do move all over the place. Within reason, they're always going to run through Avebury, but they won't necessarily run through the same two stones. And it was really following some of Hamish's exploits that really David and I decided that we would go down to the Hurlers and start dowsing as both lines actually meet within the middle stone circle. And being dowsers, you sit there having a couple of beers in the evening and think, this is going to be a bloody good idea tomorrow. We'll get in the car and go and do something, because that's what dowsers do. Bored dowsers are even more dangerous. They come up with the most outlandish theories possible. So, the Hurlers, the middle stone circle, the Michael line coming in from the left-hand side, the Mary line coming in from the bottom, meeting almost by the centre stone, crossing and actually again moving. We went there a couple of weeks afterwards, and actually Michael had moved from in between these two stones to here. Mary seems to be fixed in most of her positions within the stone circle, but Michael seems to be quite flexible the way he moves. And one of the stones here is the sacrifice stone. whether it is or not, it douses as though there were certain sacrifices there over the years, not many of them, but it seemed to be sort of a latter day thing rather than the original purpose. So these things are, it's a very, very energetic site when you walk in. A lot of people, unless you have any protection on, tend to get headaches in many cases, can often feel quite lethargic, can often feel nausea in certain cases as well. But it's certainly worthwhile going down to have a look. So we started dowsing around, laying flags all over the place. And basically we looked at the actual watercourses running beneath the stone circles as well. And I'm hoping you can see on the chart, when people have actually put the stones in, a watercourse is then brought in by human intent. And it's very much the same as churches. There are watercourses within churches which help the acoustics. And it may actually be that the acoustics will help with these in here, but it certainly energizes the granite and the substance of the stones. If water wasn't there, the energy wouldn't be quite the same as it is today. And obviously there are main big watercourses running through. There are secondary watercourses running through. Again, it's very, very, I won't use the word, the pun fluid, but it's actually very, very fluid the way these things move. But ancient man really had so much at his beck and call, by pure intent, could actually energize these sites. And with Avebury as well, there's quite a lot of work going on there at the moment, doing a very similar thing with intent, with meditation. The sites are beginning to sort of become quite energized as well. So when David and I were there, we started to look at really the original reasoning behind the stone circles. Now, part of this work is actually all to do with the work called The Shining Ones by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. Unfortunately, Christian passed away recently. I know Hugh's done some work with, I think Barbara Joy, isn't it, Hugh? Yeah. It's a fascinating book. It's about that thick almost. It certainly gives you lots of muscles if you're reading it in bed at night. But basically, when dowsing through it, it really was very apparent that the Ananage, or the Shining Ones, on their second diaspora coming out of Mesopotamia, coming out of the Holy Lands, actually visited a lot of the sites along the way, but particularly the Hurlers stone circle. Now, that's the two of them. A lot of the work is still being continued by their nephew, Edmund Marriage, in the bottom left-hand corner. The Golden Age project, if you're interested in any of this, the Shining Ones, their voyages around the whole of the world, both their first trip and the second trip, it's worthwhile logging onto their website, thegoldenageproject.org. Now, the diaspora, as they came through from really bottom end of Iran, moving through Greece, Bosnia, Norway, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, Brittany, Easter Island, to the States, over to India, and then of course across to China as well. It's a fascinating book. It basically almost goes about rewriting the Bible. I wasn't prepared to for what was actually in there, written at a very early age. Now, the Shining Ones, who were they and where did they come from? Well, the Book of Enoch tells us they were tall men, their faces shone like the sun, and their eyes burned like lamps, and their breath from their mouths was like smoke. Their clothes were remarkable, being purplish, and on their shoulders were things that I can only describe as light golden wings. They were from the astral plane, given material bodies and sent to earth for various purposes, both good and bad. And this could well be what they look like. But I think the next picture from Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico, I think, is probably the classic picture of what a Shining One would look like. In some ways, very, very close to what the Greys are looking like these days from the ET side of things. Shining One face, it does douse very much that way. These ruins are 10,000 years old. Now, as you can probably see in there, a lot of mythology, it is quite amazing. Mythology seems to be based on fact, a lot of it anyway. So you've got in Greece, you've got Kronos, you've got Zeus, you've got Ares, you've got Hermes, Aphrodite. The same in Norway, the various gods that many of us have heard about, and I think Hollywood have been exploiting over the last few years. And of course in Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of God light. are classic. They've worshipped the Shining Ones for many, many years. And you start talking to people over there, and it's a natural way of life. Over here, perhaps people are slightly more sceptical. Now, in Easter Island, they've been there. In South America, the Aztecs, and many other, the Olmecs, working their way through. And of course into Atlantis as well. Now, I've always believed in Atlantis, even as a child. My parents never did. They always thought I was barking mad, but hey, sitting and talking here now, I feel probably quite in my own zone now, which is actually rather nice. But certainly with the book, it's a fascinating book and actually runs through a lot of the Atlantic periods. And there's a lot of books written by the two, by Barbara Joy and Christian, on Atlantis itself. The website, incredibly informative. Let's get back to the Hurlers. Now, the interesting thing about the Bible, and also from the Shining Ones, they always arrived on top of a hill, out of sight of the local population, as Yahweh always did in the Bible. Now, Yahweh's always arrived in a pillar of cloud, or a pillar of fire, or a pillar of smoke. And you start looking at many of the sites that are associated with the Shining Ones, and often with some of the stone circles here. There often are quite big hills nearby, and the Hurlers is a classic case. If I just go back, you've got the ground disappears very, very... Is it going to work? Hang on a minute. Yeah, the ground disappears very, very quickly over the top, and we'll come back to this area in a few minutes' time. You've then got the cheese ring at the very, very back. Now, it's amazing from a lot of local people. I think in those days, yes, they were intelligent people. They were very earth-orientated, but obviously they were very, very spiritual people at the same time. Probably not enlightened. I think enlightened has perhaps brought out a different meaning over the last number of years. And the site we dowsed was started in 3128 BC and took 6 years to build. The Shining Ones enlisted the help of the local Druids due to their belief system, although the Shining Ones felt the Druids at the time were not particularly enlightened beings. And the Shining Ones last visited the site just before our AD period. Now, the original reason for the site, and as proved by Christian, who was a geologist and also an architect, not an architect, let's go with the archaeologist, sorry, yeah, thank you. Thank you. What he looked at is using the 3 stone circles and actually these beehives that were built on nearby Cowardin Hill, and these beehives were 15, 20 feet, 25 feet tall. There are still remains up there these days, although it's not difficult, they're not easy to find. There's also a big television mast up there, which actually forbids people going anywhere close to. So during the course of a year, they could look at each of those beehives and actually work out exactly the day of the year. And there's Cowardin Hill. And if you guys are mathematicians, then you can look at this. I'm not. It looks incredibly complex, but actually by mathematical deduction and working with directions and compasses, this is how Christian actually mapped out the original purpose of the Hurlers. So quite fascinating, I think, from that point of view. It's just a shame where the building materials have all now disappeared. They've all been taken down to local houses, and if you start dowsing around the area, you can often see in their foundations, or the outer edge of the foundations, where these big stones have come to. Now, the interesting thing about all this, these things cannot go on forever. I guess people wax and wane. The power, maybe the local druid will wax and wane. Belief systems will wax and wane very easily too. And this is really when we were there. We discovered a lot more than was originally apparent. Now, once the beehives had started to be knocked down, the original builders of the stone circles had disappeared. Others then came along and used the stone circles for their own purposes, and obviously with new religious ceremonies and belief patterns. Now, the only way really to do this is if you look at that, Old Trafford. Now, can you imagine, I know we all know what it's for nowadays, but can you imagine what people in 1,000 years' time thought might have happened there? There was no way they would actually picture 22 men doing something with a football, but a religious ceremony, I think there's a very good chance. Can you imagine football in 1,000 years' time? But I think from a religious point of view, yes. And the same thing happened with the Hurlers. So, David and I, we came along with far too much time on our hands and started to ask daft questions. And as I mentioned before, this is when things really start to get quite messy, because with Dowsing you can ask questions on anything: the past, the present, the future. Health matters. What's a good bottle of wine to drink in Bosnia? What's a good pint of beer to drink? How many pints of beer you can drink before you fall over? And why you wake up with a hangover the next morning, perhaps you haven't drank the right pint. So this is how it went. We were standing there in the middle of the stone circle, and I asked, are there any more stone circles here than apparent? And the answer came back yes. So we kind of said, well, how many more stone circles were there? 12. And that was kind of really it, forgive the bottom bit from airplane, but we really were kind of quite shocked by the answer. So the well-known blue-arse fly, I tell you what, it had nothing on the pair of us that day. Once we've discovered this, then we had to go back to the car to get some notebooks. They were left in the middle of the stone circle, and off we went to try and find out where these missing stone circles were. Because of the lead workings that have been going on there over the years, it's actually very, very difficult. But once you start dowsing, once you start looking for them, you can actually work out where they were. And this is the original drawing that took. We went back later on to actually take some compass bearings as well. So when we finally got our act together, this is actually a much better drawing of actually what we found. So you've got the original middle 3 stone circles. On the bottom here, you've got the pipers, which are 2 stones that are still standing. As you start walking around the site, you've got 2 further stones at the bottom here. One has actually fallen over, and the other one there's a stump. So again, they echoed quite nicely what was found at the pipers. And as you start walking to the northwest, you start finding other stones that actually are lying down. So we began to build up a picture really of actually what then happened. So the first circle to the left-hand side of the pipers, dowsed very much as a marriage ceremony circle, that the priests and priestesses who were there at the time, and there were both, and actually it was, although it was more of a matriarchal society, had to still be men involved in the marriage ceremony. Not to actually get married to, because before I go on to that one, but both the priest and priestesses, there had to be a priest involved to actually make it law. So they would all start off from this little circle over the side. We dowsed it, and actually once you got there, you could actually pick out where the stones had originally been. You start digging down with rods, and you can actually pick up the stones that are still there. And they would actually come over the road, they would actually walk through the pipers. It's a bit like the Buddhist philosophy. When you actually walk through, you can actually walk through cleansing stones, you can actually walk through a cleansing hut with what do they start turning? They're the spinning wheels. You actually walk through there, you leave your old life behind and actually start with the new. And this seemed to be the reason behind the pipers. Walking into the central stone circle and always standing just off centre where that off-centre stone was that we'd seen beforehand. The next one we then found was the starting point for the wedding couples, which is actually north of the site. They start off at south of the site. They start off at the bottom circle, walk over the road, through the 2 stones that have fallen through, and into the central circle where they would wait for the priests. And then a more complex picture. You have the male initiate. Then you had the going on from there. We started to look at the actual religious side behind it as well. So you've actually got the marriage side worked on, both sides. You had the priest circle worked on, and then we started to look at what the top circle was all about, and it was very much of an initiate's circle, that before you could actually go and practice as a priest or a priestess, you had to perform your initiate rites actually within the main circle, the top circle. So we found a male initiate starting circle, top left-hand corner. There's only 2 stones left there, but the imprint of the original stones are still there. To the far right-hand side, there was a female initiate starting circle with quite a number of stones, again walking through 1 fallen stone and a stone that's disappeared on the right-hand side. And finally the priests and priestesses starting circle, working its way through, crossing over the male initiate's path and into the top circle where the ceremonies would then start taking place. Whoop, hang on a minute, is that going to work? Excuse me a second. That's better. Now, we've dealt with the Shining Ones in the first place, having built the original 3 stone circles. These other ones were coming in just as we moved towards the AD period. The Shining Ones were coming through at the time, but their visits were a lot less. So the priests would still build a circle for them, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes' time, but very much as they started the religious ceremonies, they were almost forgetting about the Shining Ones. They were forgetting about the original purposes of the stone circles, the original astronomical alignment. It was beginning to take secondary place. But they started using things for their own purposes, and they just felt that a marriage circle makes a great deal of sense these days. The same within the church. An initiate circle as well. It keeps their power. It keeps the whole thing in one particular place. Now, as we said before, when Yahweh arrives, he likes to arrive in a pillar of smoke. The hill that I pointed out a bit earlier on is coming through. Is coming through about here. So the big top circle that we discovered with the 2 inner circles you cannot see from any of the 3 stone circles within the Hurlers. And as you start walking around, David went off to the left clockwise, I went anti-clockwise. And basically when you're dowsing, you tend to look at the floor. And we actually then bumped into each other at the top right-hand corner. You can still see 1 or 2 stones where the red arrows are pointing, and also the outline of the original stone circle. Because of the lead works, you could easily say, well, perhaps it was just lead mining, but they tended to do in small veins. They tended to dig quite small holes rather than long trenches. And with a bit of imagination, you can actually pick up a bit of a bank running its way through. It's a very small henge there, but a lot of it is just being wiped out completely. So this, I think, was a slightly earlier version of perhaps what Avebury was then like. And obviously then they went on to do Stonehenge afterwards. So Yahweh, the Shining Ones, would always appear at the top end of the hill. You know, whether the stone circles were then used as circles or stones to put a wooden structure on top, to put a hut on top, again, it's very much that way described within the Shining Ones book. The stone circle itself is very zippy. It's very buzzy when you get inside, especially when you start tracing the pathway back to the little circle top right hand corner where either a priest or priestess would actually go and meet one of the Shining Ones. There's a lot of energy that's working itself around there, a lot of energetic spirals within that particular place as well. Now the bottom circle became a funeral circle. The interesting thing again about the Buddhist side of life, especially in Tibet, is that there's very little earth up there to actually bury your dead in. So they specialise in sky burials. There's one particular man in the village who is generally non-Buddhist, who will then be employed to actually take the body up the hill, cut the body up into as smaller pieces as he possibly can, to then let the birds take all the flesh away, and for the little rodents to actually gnaw the bones. Because here, with many of our burial mounds, they really weren't big enough to get hundreds of full skeletons in. So they used to tend to use the femur, the long leg, the long bone in the leg. The original circle at the bottom had many stones put in it. It was almost blocked up, so the body would actually be put into the centre of the stone circle. The birds could come in and peck away at it. The small rodents could come through some of the gaps in the stones, but things like foxes and wolves couldn't get in because the stones were so high. They stopped them getting in, so the bones would still remain in place. Certainly the big ones would remain in place. So they would then take it up to Willerton Longbarrow or any of the Longbarrows locally and place their shaman's bone as a centerpiece within the main burial chamber. Again, within the stone circle, it's not a nice place to stand. I guess the daft thing about dowsing is you can stand there and say, show me the most detrimental place to go and stand, and often the point is you're actually standing in it in the first place. You're thinking, wonder why you're beginning to fall over or not feeling very well. There are several places like this. In Avebury there's one. If you walk up to the South Downs above Chichester, there's some wonderful long barrows above the downs. And if you start walking westward along there and actually ask the rod to point you to a very good place for bodies to rot, there is one there as well. and it's not particularly nice. It has a very, very unusual atmosphere there. The trees are a little bit gnarled. You know, nature doesn't like it as much as the human beings don't like it either. So the site became a sort of fascination for both of us, not just the fact that it had been used for astronomical alignments in the first place, but then how it had changed face over those years. And I think also, to a certain point, Avebury as well. Big astronomical alignments down there. You've still got some wonderful, wonderful alignments down there, but again, it was taken over probably just before the AD period and used by people for some very, very unusual ceremonies. I think probably quite dark ceremonies. If you start walking into the northern circle, the cove on the right-hand side, the energies there are certainly far more mystical and certainly far more dark than they are at the southern circle, which always seems to be very much cultivated, lots of sheep that seem to be happy down there, but the northern circle doesn't get as many visitors. We've been doing quite a lot of work up there recently, and in fact I had a flashback of one of our visits up there of lots and lots of fires being built within the stone circles and actually pouring almost animal fat on it to actually create dark smoke. So this dark smoke would add further to the mysticism. People would see this dark smoke drifting over the henge, over the outside of the henge, and actually wonder what on earth was going on inside. The Stukely drawings, showing a little bit of what we've discovered at the Hurlers, are very, very similar, where they would pick up the male and female marriage partners leaving from the sanctuary, walking their way up through to the south circle, and for the priests to actually come from the Beckhampton row, the Beckhampton circle, to move through into the top row to perform their mystical rites first of all, to then go through to the southern circle, talk to the marriage people, bless them, and obviously then the conjugal rites would then start there and then within the southern circle. I think it happened in many, many of the original sites, but then, hey, people come along and change it to their own ends, as they do a little bit these days as well. So, the Hurler's key is very much that. You've got the wedding couple starting point. It builds into a rather nice, complex, but actually to me very, very logical map. It wasn't really until we got back home that night we actually really thought about the enormity of what we'd found. We then went back the next day and it was raining a little bit, but everything was being blown all over the place, flags were being uprooted, so we had to go back a few days afterwards when the sun came out again. But if you can never get down there and start having a dowse round, start the centre circle, find the Michael and Mary line, find out where they go, find out the sort of energies they're giving out, and also find out the power point as well, where it is within the stone circle. Hamish Miller, one of the doyens really of dowsing, unfortunately passed away in January last year. If you haven't got the Sun and Serpent book, I urge you to buy it. And also there's a book being written about Hamish's life very, very recently called Life Divined, giving a few ideas of what really Hamish was all about, how he discovered some of the stone circles, and his love of dowsing, basically, and his love of earth energies. Without Hamish, earth energies, I think, would be probably sort of 20 years further back than it is at the moment. What I also wanted just to really talk about briefly, and we touched on Bosnia slightly earlier on, is, I don't know if anybody's heard of the pyramids in Bosnia, these pyramids they've been discovering in Bosnia. Okay. Hugh's, I think, going to a conference this year. I went to one, the first one they had about 3 years ago. And there were some remarkable similarities down there to some of the ancient sites that we're finding in the UK. And also some rather nice alignments coming through as well, coming up to the Skeelings, coming up through the Hurlers, wending its way down. I couldn't get a map big enough on screen, wending its way down through some very, very sacred sites in the Holy Land. Now, that's what it looks like. This was one taken, I think, back in about 1920. You can see the pyramid top, well, obviously, I haven't got to say, see the pyramid on the top right-hand corner. It's very, very pyramid-like. It's very much the cardinal points, north, south, east and west, as all the pyramids are in Egypt. It's in Visoko, which is just north of Sarajevo. It's a fascinating place. And again, if you start dowsing and start walking around lots of sacred sites within the UK, you get a feeling of what's there. The power of the place, the energy of the place. Visoko is no exception. You kind of get there, as you drive into Visoko, you get this view from the road. We then stopped, we took some photographs, but the the eagerness and the anticipation of everybody actually standing on this thing was tangible. You could almost taste it. Now, there are the three sites. You've got the Pyramid of the Sun, that one, Pyramid of the Moon, and Pyramid of Love down here. They also, they've done some wonderful mathematical work on this, alignments on this, to actually sort of see how they work through, all to do with the original angles within the Great Pyramid of Giza. Actually works out exactly the same coordinates, exactly the same angles as these three areas. So as we're then getting closer, and as you get on towards the pyramid, you find these amazing limestone, almost concrete-like blocks. Now, when we were over there at the time, they were saying that it's not man-made. These are all natural. They've been there. It's all to do with the result of earthquakes. They were naturally formed. The earthquake came along and broke them up like this. They weren't a coating. There's a lot more research been done over the last 3 to 4 years, and I would like to try and get over to the conference this year if we could, to actually prove that this stuff is actually man-made. It's like a concrete, it's like a conglomerate, and it's lining all over the face of this pyramid. Now, the Egyptians, the Egyptologists who were over there were very, very scathing and very sceptical about it all. But of course it basically means, if proved right, it actually dwarfs their pyramids by hundreds and hundreds of feet. And this thing's about sort of 600 feet tall. The original hill, everybody felt was kind of shaped that way, but man has influenced it, man has angled it even further. The little pimple, let me just go back one, the little pimple you see on the top is the remains of an old Roman fort, but that actually goes back thousands and thousands of years. Even before the Romans, the kings and queens of Bosnia were always crowned on top of this pyramid. There are tunnels leading through it. There was an escape route that we found that the kings and queens of Bosnia would always find if the castle was under attack by people outside. And the way into it, is it working? Is the right-hand corner where the little tree is spiking up. You actually walk through it up to the top. Now, the great thing about this, again, compared to the Buddhist side, and forgive me to keep bringing Buddhism into it, but it's the classic bit of no pain. The Buddhist monasteries are always built in the most inaccessible places, especially if you go to Tibet. I mean, they are awkward sods to get to. You kind of get there, you're hallucinating because you're so far up from an altitude point of view, but you kind of get there and you're puffed out and you're absolutely shattered. But of course you're walking into this wonderful holy place that has been, the chanting's been going on for hundreds if not thousands of years, and you're just overawed by it all. And the same with this as well. There was a wonderful map which I haven't shown on here that actually took in the three sites: the pyramid of the moon, the pyramid of the sun. So they would start off there from here, the religious ceremonies here. They would actually walk to the pyramid of the moon, do further ceremonies there, and from there they would actually walk up the steep slopes here, almost like, not quite labyrinth-like, but they would actually trace a path round the pyramid to get to the top. So these poor devils were absolutely knackered when they got up there, but of course ready to be talked to be initiated, to perhaps have a spiritual journey, if you like. It's like a spiritual high. They're probably dehydrated, hallucinating, and that was kind of part of what this is all about. So on the right-hand side, you've got the tunnels leading into, it's about a mile from the hillside, this labyrinth they're now still excavating, that they feel there is a connection to the pyramid. Again, by dowsing, there is one there. They will find it, but it's going to take a couple of years to actually get down there. The interesting point when you're there is, in certain areas, there are still mines lying around. Now, I kind of pinpointed them by dowsing, but I certainly didn't go in the field to try and prove the point. So a lot of the fields around there haven't been excavated yet, even though they know there's some pretty special stuff underneath. The guy on the right-hand side, Samir, was over here recently doing a talk at Megalithomania, I believe. A great character, very much of a... who's the guy from... well, the Hollywood films with Indiana Jones, yeah. Very much of an Indiana Jones type, and quite a character. I I told him, you can go in there, but if you keep to a little path, you won't hit the mines. Even he didn't trust me. Bottom right-hand corner, a guy called Maladin. We've got this amazing, just bringing this one in, I couldn't really leave you without mentioning this. These amazing stone balls, which are about 20 miles northeast from Vesico. And these things, as you can see, are absolutely massive. Everybody thought, the geologists thought they'd just rolled down the hill. But unfortunately, the actual valley itself was only probably about 200-300 yards long. And these were halfway down the valley. So I can't see really from an erosion point of view, unless somebody's picked them up and put them back up there again for them to roll down the hill and do it again and again and again. So they figured these are actually man-made. Why they're there, still nobody really knows, but they're certainly doused as man-made. A lot of them have been broken up. People originally thought there might have been treasure inside. The fairies might have made them and left gold inside for them. So a lot of these things have been broken, but there's probably about 5 or 6 left there, which you can still go and stand on and douse, and that was Maladin dowsing at the time. Now, whilst we were there, and to the back side of the Pyramid of the Moon, a farmer came up, and I was doing some dowsing in the field, and said, "What are you doing?" in Bosnian. Lucky we had a Bosnian guy with us who could actually translate. And we told him what we were doing. We were dowsing, and they were looking at the pyramid here, and we were looking at all these lovely slabs that had been found around the place. And he said, "Come with us, we've got something special to show you at the field." So about, I don't know, a quarter of a mile away, we all walked in the baking sun. And we came across this burial mound. I mean, the 3 Brits who were there, the 4 Brits couldn't believe it. It was just a classic, almost English burial mound. I know you get them all over the place, but it was just so perfect. Now, if you douse, say West Kennet Long Barrow, or you look at the plan of it, and also if you, which I think Peter's talking about it afterwards, so it'll be quite interesting for his follow-on talk. If you then start dowsing and looking at some of the oldest buildings in the world in Malta, a lot of them as you walk in have these side chambers. West Kennet has certainly 2, and the big one at the end, it obviously went on for another 120, 130 feet. This thing has side chambers. Only 1 each as you walk in, and there are human remains in there. So they haven't excavated it yet, or if they start on it, I haven't had any news through, but I'd like to try and go back and see. But on top of it, you've got these massive slabs that are almost precast, and the same as the pyramid. Now, I can't really leave without talking about alignments, because I know everybody loves alignments around here, and everybody talks about alignments, and if Sean was here, he'd probably quite like this one. In between Sarajevo and Vesico, which is just to the left-hand side of, Vesico you can see in the middle, and Zenica at the top. Now, that's what it aligns from. This is standing on top of the Pyramid of the Sun. And you've got this amazing 2 notched hills with the big hill that overlooks Sarajevo in the background. It's one of these perfect alignments. You just stand there and go, wow. So I took a photograph of it, and yeah, it kind of gives you a big buzz. But as you stood on the top of the pyramid, the energies up there are almost indescribable. The dowsing rods start, you see with many people, just excuse me 2 seconds. With dowsing rods, there's a nice free-flowing dowsing rods. You often see people walking along going, look, my dowsing rod is spinning, what have I found? And you'd always ask the question, well, what are you looking for? I don't know. So generally you always teach people to douse, so they're picking the dowsing rods up, and the dowsing rods are fairly still until they find an earth energy line or a water course. I had both mine up. I tend to normally douse with just 1 hand rather than 2. I was up there and my rods just started spinning and I couldn't stop them. Okay, yes, you can stop them once, but they just stood there and they just span. I've never known it anywhere else that I've been to, whether it's in the middle of Avebury, whether it's in the middle of any stone circles or any other sacred sites. These things were almost taking off, and it was a fascinating spot. But unfortunately, there's a big problem there between Sam or Samir Osmanagic and their archaeological side and the official archaeologists working for the Bosnian government. They don't like each other, and we had to sneak up here one day, and luckily the conference had finished. So we actually drove up there. We got up here for a couple of hours, and then actually we started talking to some of the local archaeologists, and they were sort of quite happy with it. But they said if their boss turned up, then we have to skedaddle. They don't like dowsing rods up there. They don't like foreigners up there. They don't like alignments. They don't like anything to do with the Pyramid of the Sun or the other Bosnian peoples. They're just there to excavate the Roman fort and see what see what remains and see what palaces they find underneath, which is a great shame because if the two people combined, they could do an awful lot more about it. But work continues. But these alignments and it's like an amazing power spot there. Now, that's what it looks like when you start dowsing. And I did a bit of dowsing when I was there, but because the rods wouldn't behave themselves, when I got back home, you can remote dowse. So I got a very close scale map from some friends of mine, and I'm working on an even closer scale map at the moment. And actually just working out some of the actual earth energy lines crossing. So the green lines are earth energy. Can you make out the green lines? Most of them are green lines. The blue ones, the thicker lines, are water courses. Now, as we mentioned a bit earlier on, to really energize a site, you not only need earth energy lines, but you also need water courses. Forget ley lines for a minute. You've got ley alignments. That's the big alignment that we saw just now. You need both. You need a lot of water, and you need some good earth energy lines crossing. As I mentioned before, in churches, if you walk up to an altar, if you dowse, be careful dowsing in a church. A lot of the guys there don't like you doing it. But as you walk up to an altar, you'll find a crossing line either side of the altar, and you find normally a water course running straight up the middle of the aisle, crossing at the altar. It gives it a special effect. It also helps the acoustics. But this is really down purely to effect. This is the earth, this is man-influenced stuff. As you saw in the Hurlers, to get a complex map like this is not just Mother Earth doing what she does best. This is actually human influencing Mother Earth. To both a beneficial way, and as we've seen from the Hurlers' point of view, it can be a detrimental way as well. The Romans obviously knew it was a power base. The kings and queens of Bosnia knew it was a power base from thousands of years beforehand. It's been used and used and used. Bosnia has always been a gateway for many, many civilizations running up through, from the Holy Lands up through to Europe and back again. If you can get down there, it's a well worthwhile place to go. The guy top right-hand corner is a guy called Zombie. Zombie's about 6'4" and one of the main diggers of the team. Incredibly passionate about the site. The guy at the back is a guy called John Agnew, who's a farmer, an owner up in Suffolk, who went over there with me. Now, Zombie's sitting on one of these big blocks, and the big block on the bottom is the actual block he was sitting on from underneath. Now, these things are almost like tombstones. They're almost capstones that people have been putting on tombs over the years. But there are hundreds and hundreds of these things around the place. They've got really good sharp edges, and I know we've probably seen all the work on the Aztec temples over these. You can't get a fag paper through it. Pretty much the same with these. These are cut incredibly finely, and have obviously been used for something. Man has used them for something, but they're now scattered all over the place. As I left, I got an email from Sam with this photograph on, and I looked at it and I thought, well, you know, it could easily be Egyptian, it could be Aztec, it could be Mayan, but no, it was actually discovered only a few miles away from one of the pyramids. So really, I guess in some ways the big question is which one came first. The Egyptians will always claim that their pyramids were the first, but of course the Mediterranean's only a short hop over Egypt's only a short hop over the Mediterranean from Bosnia, and vice versa. So let's just say, you know, these guys, the Egyptians came over doing whatever they did over here, saw the Bosnian hill that was man-influenced, almost made into that pyramid shape, got the idea and they went back over to Egypt and started plagiarizing it, rather than the other way around. They will have it the other way around. They don't like the Bosnian pyramids. In fact, they go out of their way to rubbish them. But because of all this material that's built up around it, this amazing shape and the amazing alignments out there, you know, nothing is left to chance that way. You know, it cannot possibly be. So these granite blocks, these big, wonderful blocks, are there for anybody to go and dowse, and unfortunately for a lot of people to actually go and use in their foundations. So from an ancient point of view, these guys knew what they were doing. They would pick their tower of power, if you like. They would pick out one of these beautiful hills. Let me go back to that one a minute. They would pick out the alignments. They would pick out the special shaped hills. You can start looking around Wiltshire, start looking around Somerset. Once you know what to look for, the whole of the landscape has completely changed over the years. You know, nature doesn't create flat lines. nature doesn't create unusual little notches in hillside. Just have a look at them. If you see an unusual notch, the chances are there's going to be the sacred soul temple up there. And the same with lovely sacred wells as well. And there were 1 or 2 sacred wells down here, which I haven't got time to go into. But, you know, the shiny ones, it's been a fascinating journey for me, really, to probably not have heard anything from the Bible referred to as the shiny ones, to picking up the book, to then going dowsing the stone circles in the Hurlers, to then suddenly go over to Bosnia, to then suddenly live 5 miles from Avebury, to now suddenly live only a few miles from Bradford and be able to get down here to talk to you guys again. There's so much to go and discover out there. So I hope that this talk has given you something to go and look at. But I urge you, if you haven't got the Sun and Serpent book, go and grab it. Thank you very much. Now, we've got time for questions. Have you anybody